Mike Collins, thank you so much for joining me on Walking Inside Poems. How are you?
Very good, very good. Glad to be here and enjoy the episodes of yours that I listened to, the previous episodes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So we're here today to talk about a poet that I didn't know about, and I appreciate you turning me on to him, Etheridge Knight. And we want to talk about the fact that you have written a book. This is an older edition. I know you've got a new edition coming out that we'll talk about. But
Yeah.
before we get into Etheridge, tell people who you are, Mike.
Okay, so I teach at Texas A&M University in the English department, and I ended up working on Etheridge Knight because, like, I always haunt used bookstores, and I happened to find one of his books that's out of print now. And I knew one of his poems before, but then I opened it up and I thought, oh, that's really great. And then I was like, every poem I read, like this guy's really great. So I got fascinated by him and I ended up writing a paper, publishing a paper about him. And then out of the paper came the book. And then out of the book came actually I just published a book in October and it's about affirmative action. It seems like not connected, but it actually kind of grows out of this because Knight was started writing poems in prison. And so I started exploring like legal issues and so it eventually led me into other areas.
Yeah, right on. Now, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
I was born in Jamaica, and I grew up in different parts. I was there until I was 8, came to New Mexico with my parents, or to join my parents when I was 10, went back to Jamaica, came to the US again, then went to college and came to the US in Chicago, went to college in Connecticut, and eventually went to grad school, lived in New York, lived in Singapore, and then I finally ended up in Texas, like, following the job market more or less.
Yeah. And how old were you? Can you remember how old you were when you really started first getting turned on by poetry or by literature in general?
Um, I think if I remember correctly, I first was really struck by poetry when I was reading an anthology and I read Yeats's Leda and the Swan. And I thought, well, you can do more in like a brief poem than you can in a novel.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. Well,
and so like, go ahead.
that's actually one of the things that once we get into this poem we're going to talk about today, one of the points that I wanted to make is that, it's a little bit cliche, but it's been said 1,000 times that poetry is trying to say what we can't say with normal language, and I think this poem is a really good example of that. But let's hold on before we get into it. Tell us a little more about Etheridge Knight, who he was. By the way, let me just, I'm sorry to interrupt after I asked you to do that, but let me just read something from actually the first paragraph in your introduction to this book about Knight that just I think is fantastic and will give people an idea how important he is. Etheridge Knight is a mighty American poet who is relatively little known. He and Wallace Stevens stand as two poles of American poetry, according to his better known fellow writer, Robert Bly. So here's Bly basically putting him in the same sentence with Wallace Stevens, which is, I think, pretty huge in terms of, just how important of an American poet he is. Knight is no doubt a South Pole to Stevens's ice cream emperor's North, or rather, Knight was, as he often said, a poet of the belly, a poet of the earth and of the body, a poet of the gut feelings from which cries and blood oaths and arias come, while Stevens was a poet, arguably, of the ache left in the intellect after it tears itself from God. Wow, man, what a great what a great opening to this book.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, he was really fun to write about. He's like he was a fascinating person. And one of his famous statements is that, and I'm going to butcher it, but I went to, I'm paraphrasing. I went to the Korean War. I died in Korea. I was resurrected by narcotics. I died again in prison, then I was resurrected by poetry. And so he was somebody who he did serve in the military, and he said he was a medic, and he was like underage or like I think 17 or something like that, and he wasn't really prepared for what he saw in war.
Yeah.
And I guess he dipped into his medicine bag. And then when his family was in Indianapolis. He was born in the South, but the family settled eventually in Indianapolis. And he became kind of an addict, in and out of jails for petty crimes, or just, picked up by the police. His sister, who I interviewed when I was working on the book, said that the police would like beat him up, and when he went down there, and they would, because in part he was frustrated. He was so clever that they would think that he was responsible for crimes that he had nothing to do with. So they think about
Right.
uh,
Even
and
even when he was in prison, they would attribute a crime to him that happened
that's
outside. Yeah.
that's right, that's right. And so eventually, he and two other guys robbed a store clerk of I think it was like something like $15, a very small amount of money, and I'm for drugs, and he was hit with a pretty heavy sentence for that, and he ended up serving 8 years in the Indiana State Prison. And this was a time when rehabilitation was still kind of part of prison philosophy in the United States, or at least in the Indiana. And so there was a newspaper. He eventually got involved in the newspaper. He started writing poetry, sending them out. This was the era of the Black Arts movement, when there was a big flowering of not only Black writing, but Black publishing. And he got mentored and published by Dudley Randall, who founded the Broadside Press. And he got mentored by Gwendolyn Brooks, the great Pulitzer Prize winning African American poet, who actually visited him in prison. And Knight was the head of Narcotics Anonymous in the prison for a while. And when he was the head, Gwendolyn Brooks came and spoke to the group, and Knight kind of gave her flowers after her reading. And so she really mentored him, and she kind of thought that he was too verbose. And so she advised him to write haiku as a way of kind of like boiling down
Mhm.
his message, because he said when he first started writing, he was like kind of a novice in terms of like literary poetry, although he was kind of a master of toast, which are these very ribald rhyme narratives. And he said he used to use like all these like $10 words, because he thought like he wanted to say something weighty. And so, but Gwendolyn Brooks kind of made him pare it all down.
Yeah. Yeah. What years ballpark would that have been when Brooks was visiting him in prison?
He got out of prison in 1968. In fact, I could give you the exact date, because I was just writing about it, but I don't have it in. I think it must have been about 1965,
Okay.
because he got out in 68, but 64, 65, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that was such a tumultuous time in so many ways. It must have been really cool for you to just kind of discover this guy, because especially as an academic like yourself, there's who's going to write another something else about Yeats or about Stevens or about William Carlos Williams or about Robert Frost, and along comes this guy, and I'm sure you haven't gotten out of the Etheridge Knight funk since, right?
I haven't really, but it's interesting. Like, one of the reasons, like I got my new edition here. Tried to
Right on.
advertise for the publisher's sake, which came out last year. And one of the interesting things since I published my book in 2012, the first edition, is that he's really starting to kind of rise into prominence to some extent. Like, there are major African American poets now, Terrence Hayes, Reginald Dwayne Betts, who cite him as kind of like a touchstone for them.
Good.
And Betts, who did time for carjacking when he was underage. I think he went to prison when he might have been 16, something like that. And he said it was reading a Knight poem in an anthology that like made him want to be like a serious poet. And then in Indianapolis, the city's kind of starting to celebrate him, and they put up a big mural of him. I think it was last year or 2023, so like one of those two. And so he's and actually Donald Hall. I interviewed Donald Hall a couple of years before Hall died. Like this great prize-winning poet. who was, a Caucasian poet, but he was really struck by Knight, along with Bly. And I think Galwell Kinnell was also struck by him. And then Hall told me that a lot of times when poets die, you start to hear about them less and less, but he started to hear more and more about Etheridge Knight in like the years before I interviewed him, which I think about 2017. So
Nice. And by the way, I just want to say that it's not lost on me that I'm not sure when this episode is going to go live, but we're recording it the day after MLK Day. And one comment you make in this book of yours is, indeed, no matter how often he himself failed it, love remained Knight's weapon of choice. Very, very reminiscent of Dr. King. So why don't I read the poem and then let's talk about it a little bit. And then after we talk about it, maybe you can read it again to take us out. Fair enough?
okay, all right. Actually, I got a recording of Knight reading it, which is even better.
Oh, wow. Okay. So are you thinking about playing that?
I
Or
could, or you want to read it, or
I'm not sure how it'll come through. Let's try it. If you've got the recording there, if it's loud enough, let's give it a shot.
okay. Let me.
We'd much rather have him read it than me, that's for sure.
And he introduces it, which is even better.
Oh, right on. My concern is the volume, whether my recording is going to pick it
No,
up.
he starts low.
Okay.
The violent space.
Can you hear that?
When your sister sleeps around.
It's low, but I think it'll work.
Okay,
So
all right.
Let it roll.
Okay.
I made this up just about during the same time I made a poem for Franklin Fitzgerald. And because I was thinking about certain violences. I had been involved with a couple of women who had been into the streets, and they told me about some kinds of violence. And I was thinking that the only men who could probably relate to certain fears that women have were young men in prison. If the average man, if I'm walking down a dark alley and I got some money in my pocket, I have a fear. The fear is that somebody might knock me in the head, take my money. But the fear is not that I'm going to be sexually assaulted. And young men in prison are the only ones I think that could probably relate to the fear that a lot of women have. And she was telling me about all these fears and the violence there. Anyway, the violent space, or when your sister sleeps around for money. Exchange in greed the ungraceful signs, thrust the thick notes between green apple breasts, then the shadow of the devil descends, the violent space cries and angel eyes, large and dark retreat in innocence and in ice. Run, sister, run, the booger man comes. The violent space cries silently, like you cried wide years ago in another space, speckled by the sun and the leaves of a green plum tree, and you were stung by a red wasp, and we flew home. Run, sister, run, the booger man comes. Well, hell, little sis, wasps still sting. You are all of 17 and as alone now in your pain as you were with the sting on your brow. Well, shit, little sis, what should I do? Should I squat in the dust and make strange markings on the ground? Shall I chant a spell to drive the demon away? Run, sister, run, the booger man comes. In the beginning, you were the Virgin Mary, and you are the Virgin Mary now. but somewhere between Nazareth and Bethlehem, you lost your name in the nameless void. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Oh, Mary, shake your butt to the violent juke, absorb the demon puke, and watch the white eyes pop. Run, sister, run, the booger man comes. And what do? I boil my tears in a twisted spoon and dance like an angel on the point of a needle. I sit counting syllables like Midas gold. I am not bold. I cannot yet take hold of the demon and lift his weight from your black belly. So I grab the air and sing my song, but the air cannot stand my singing long.
Wow. So powerful. So powerful.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. He actually omitted one line. I was following along, and in the third stanza, he went straight from "well, shit, little sis, what should I do?" and in the at least the printed version, it's "well, shit, little sis, here we are, you and I and this poem."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
One of the things he always said is that he saw poetry as oral before it was written, and is even primarily oral. And so he would recite from memory, and just like a singer or a performer. And he even, in one really interesting essay, he talks about when you speak, the vibrations of your voice cause the bones in the audience's ears to vibrate. And so there's this like kind of visceral connection that he feels is lost on the page. And so I think he might have allowed himself the freedom to kind of improvise a little bit.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A poet I really like, David White. I really like the way he reads, because what he often does is he'll read a line and then read it again, and sometimes a third time before he goes on, and then you rush to the printed thing and say, "Oh, it's not printed 3 times." No, but that's the way he wanted to read it that way. So I love it. It's a performance. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, the at the very end there, he read, "and lift his weight from your black belly." And in the printed version, it says, "and lift his weight from you, black belly." I wonder, is that a typo, or is that was that in the printed version sort of a slang of or I wonder what that is.
I think it's probably a typo, although it always shows
Okay.
up that way. But like I never like looked into that. That's a good question.
Well, I was being a little picky there. So let's
Although
talk
you
about
can, if you're using African American vernacular, you could kind of like change it to your black belly.
yeah,
But
that's what
I think that might be a typo. My guess is a typo.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's how I read it originally, and it was interesting when he read it. So a couple things I just wanted to point out that I've noticed. I noticed there's several times that green comes up. Green is in the first and the second stanza, which is interesting to me. Green apple breasts and green plum tree, and
Right.
there's some really cool rhymes going on here. It's not a typical rhyming poem, but for example, let's see. Oh, Mary, shake your butt to the violent juke, absorb the demon puke, and watch the eyes pop. Those sort of internal
Right.
rhymes are really interesting. Now, the Boogerman. Tell us, who is the Boogerman?
Like the boogeyman, I guess, like like the scary person, the scary like monster that frightens children.
Yeah.
If you don't behave, the boogeyman's going to get you.
Yeah, yeah.
That
It's
kind of
just
like that. Huh?
it's a threat of violence. It's a something scary. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Right.
Now, I
Yeah.
read in your book that he not only is this not about one of his own 4 sisters, but he had some explaining to do with those 4 sisters. That this wasn't.
Yeah.
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 And you notice in
Because
his introduction, he says,
the subtitle is "When Your Sister Sleeps Around for Money," and I guess he meant that more like my brothers and my sisters as opposed to my literal sister.
Yeah, well, he tells different versions of the origin. Like in the introduction that I just played, he says like he was involved with some women who like kind of were involved in the streets.
Yeah.
And then I've read somewhere, I think I can't remember where I read it, that he might have heard the story from somebody and put it into a poem, or heard of that part of it about the sister. And so but yeah, he does stress. And I
Yeah.
made sure I put it in the book because I was going to interview his sister. So
Pretty funny.
so because I had introduced it, so I made sure I put that in his book, in the
Yeah.
book, that he said like it wasn't any of his actual sisters.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And as I said earlier, I think this poem is for me, it's a really good example of that idea that poetry is trying to express something that can't be expressed in normal words. This is you can write a narrative or talk about the threat of the boogeyman, or the experience of a woman being concerned about being preyed upon, concern about your sisters, etc. But that doesn't add up to what this poem does. It's a beautiful poem. It's a painful poem in a way, too.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
find it fascinating that the end of the first four stanzas are all the same. Run, sister, run, the boogeyman comes. But the parenthetical at the end of the last stanza, and by the way, I'll put the text of this poem in the show notes for folks so you can read along,
Thanks.
or buy the book. Um,
Yes.
but then that last parent for the last stanza, the parenthetical is, "But the air cannot stand my singing long." What do you make of that? So I grab air and sing my song, but the air cannot stand my singing long.
Okay, now this is like something like that comes up in several of his poems, because he's in the he's singing this poem from from being, he's in prison. And so he's creating this poem in prison, and he's inside, so he can't go to her and protect her. And one of the things he said about, there's another poem of his, it's hard to make a poem in prison because the air doesn't really tolerate anything but harsh words. And so that's part of it. I think that's part of what he's getting at, that I sing my song, but this kind of the prison environment it doesn't can't stand my singing long. So I think that's part of what he's getting at. And so the whole thing is about like, okay, I can't physically go and protect her, but can I? And again, the persona, the night persona, I should say night itself. I can't physically go and protect her, but maybe I can make an incantation with this poem. Like should I, in the third stanza, he says, "And what do I do? Should I squat in the dust and make strange markings on the ground? Should I chant a spell to drive the demon away?" And so he's trying to do that, but he can't overcome the whole institution. And he talks not only about the speaker, the persona being in prison, but he follows Malcolm X in saying that for a black man of his generation, like the whole country is in a way a kind of prison that you're trapped in because of the limitations of opportunity, stereotypes. He thought that his sentence was outrageous, like given the crime, that kind of thing. And so,
Guilty of
uh,
being black in America.
right, right. And so you can't with an incantation overcome all that, but you can try to nevertheless, make as powerful an incantation as you can.
Yeah. I cannot yet take hold of the demon and lift his weight from your black belly. Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
And dance like an angel on the point of a needle. I'm trying to remember. It seems like from my youth, in my Catholic upbringing, I was given that image
Yes.
of angels dancing, and I can't remember what it was about.
I think
Help
it's
us.
supposed to be how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, and it's
Yeah,
supposed to be like this kind of deep Catholic theological investigation, these thick books of theology where they like speculate about every possible variation on ideas like angels and
yeah,
what kinds of angels there are, what you must do to gain absolution from sin, all that stuff.
yeah, yeah. There was even, this is a little bit of a tangent, but there was even some speculation and discussion about whether Jesus defecated or not.
Really?
Yeah, in those kind of wild analyses from, I guess, Middle Ages where they were looking at these kind of things. Okay, well, what else? Is there anything else you'd like to say about this poem in particular? Let me ask you, do you teach this poem? Do you, in any of your classes, do you use this poem?
I haven't yet. You know what? Like, I have this weird peculiarity that usually when I'm writing about something, I don't like to teach it because if I teach something, sometimes I'll lose interest in writing about it. And, s- and so
Yeah,
if I think I might want to write some more about it, I won't teach it. There are times when like I've taught something and then gone on to write about it, but a lot of times I just like won't. It'll like somehow it'll short circuit whatever happens. So, but I
that's
think I'm
really
at the end. Since this book I've been asked to write a couple essays where I talk about night. So I think at this point I can start teaching it. So,
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I've had similar things, you know. I've had similar things that it's sort of related to um, when you do something as part of your job, so to speak, for money, or have the pressure of teaching it, it loses its sparkle for you a little bit. You know, I too taught in the English department here at Texas A&M
really?
University, and I have to tell you, I'm pretty sure that I enjoy literature and poetry in particular more now. I'm not teaching it. You know, I'm just celebrating it now, which makes it a lot more. Of course, you're doing more than that. You're writing about it. But yeah, that's interesting. I can think I see what you mean there. Was there anything else you want to say about this poem or about Etheridge Knight before we sign off here?
Um, I just love the, I just one of the things that's cool that the wonder of it that I like to preserve is a great line like I count my syllables like Midas is gold. You know, I'm not gold. I count my syllables like Midas gold, and it's partly saying like I don't have the power beyond like making like these perfect lines where I'm counting syllables, but it says a lot about his poetic practice that's also expressing this frustration he has that he can't, just like conjure away the walls of the prison and conjure away the demon that's attacking this woman. Oh, and the other thing, okay, really quick, do I have a minute?
No hurry, no hurry. Yeah.
Okay, one thing I really want to say is that the introduction, he says he always says I made up this poem. He said I wrote it. He's made up this poem at about the same time he wrote for Freckle-Faced Gerald, which is actually a very much an often anthologized poem of his about like a 16-year-old who's in prison, and Knight says it was based on his actual knowledge of a young adolescent who was in jail, and there was a white adolescent at the same time, and the black kid was thrown in among the adult convicts and he was like just raped until he was kind of like a zombie almost, and he said like but the warden protected the white kid, and so like the whole idea of the title, the violent space, it's like this violent kind of state of mind in which people get caught and brutalized. And so it could happen to the young woman in the poem, or it could happen to Freckle-Faced Gerald. So he kind of investigates these very profound areas of life.
Yeah. Uh, would you mind reading it?
Me read it?
Yeah, if you would, I'd love to hear the poem in your voice.
Okay. Um, Exchange and greed. Let me read the title first. The violent space, or when your sister sleeps around for money. Exchange and greed, the ungraceful signs. Thrust the thick notes between green apple breasts. Then the shadow of the devil descends. The violent space cries, and angel eyes, large and dark, retreat in innocence and in ice. Run, sister, run, the boogeyman comes. The violent space cries silently, like you cried wide years ago in another space speckled by the sun and the leaves of a green plum tree. And you were stung by a red wasp when we flew home. Run, sister, run, the boogeyman comes. Well, hell, little sis, wasps still sting. You are all of 17 and as alone now in your pain as you were with the sting on your brow. Well, shit, little sis, here we are, you and I and this poem. And what should I do? Should I squat in the dust and make strange markings on the ground? Shall I chant a spell to drive the demon away? Run, sister, run, the boogerman comes. In the beginning, you were the Virgin Mary, and you are the Virgin Mary now. But somewhere between Nazareth and Bethlehem, you lost your name in the nameless void. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Oh, Mary, shake your butt to the violent juke, absorb the demon puke, and watch the white eyes pop. Run, sister, run, the boogerman comes. And what do? I boil my tears in a twisted spoon and dance like an angel on the point of a needle. I sit counting syllables like Midas gold. I am not bold. I cannot yet take hold of the demon and lift his weight from your black belly. So I grab the air and sing my song, but the air cannot stand my singing long.
Nice. Michael Collins, thank you so much for doing this and talking to us about Etheridge Knight. I got this from the collected poems. I suspect there are more for people who want to look more into him. And again, your book, Understanding Etheridge Knight, if people are interested in that, I will provide links in the show notes to this episode. But again, thank you for doing this, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right, man. Take care.
Bye.